Riverside Federal Prison welcomed Caleb like a waking hallucination. Everything about the arrival felt unreal, like watching someone else's life unfold from outside his own body. The cold, gray concrete, the clanging of metal doors, the guards' clipped commands, they all came through as if muffled by thick cotton. The intake process dragged on like a slow, grinding ritual. Look straight ahead. Don't smile. Press harder. Cough. Bend. Stretch. Each order barked with mechanical disinterest, each step stripping away another layer of humanity. In the medical inspection room, a stone-faced guard gave the next command. Strip. Everything. Caleb undressed slowly, trying to hold onto a sliver of dignity. But dignity had no place here. He was no longer a person, just a body, checked for contraband, infections, and gang tattoos. Bend over. Spread your cheeks. Same monotone voice. Same absence of empathy. By the end of the search, Caleb felt violated, like something sacred had been stolen. A quick shower followed, the disinfectant stinging his skin and leaving it blotchy and red. Then came the uniform, ill-fitting, reeking of bleach and someone else's sweat. It all felt like a dream he couldn't wake from. A bad dream. Reed, let's go. Another guard led him down a narrow corridor, their footsteps echoing off the bare cement walls. Every turn, every gate brought him deeper into a new reality, one where 7 years of his life would be measured out in routine and repetition. 7 years. 2,555 days. He repeated the number in his mind, but it still didn't feel real. They stopped at multiple checkpoints. IDs were checked, names verified. Caleb noticed eyes watching him, other inmates sizing him up, judging, categorizing. Fresh meat, someone muttered. Don't stop, the guard ordered. Finally, they reached the end of SE Block. The guard paused in front of a steel door. Cell 238. Delgado is your cellmate, an old-timer. He'll show you how things work. Keep your head down and you'll be fine. With a metallic screech, the door opened. Inside sat a stocky Hispanic man in his 50s, with graying hair at the temples and a long scar across his left cheek. He didn't look up from the worn paperback in his hands. Welcome to hell, newcomer, he said flatly, flipping a page. Hope you don't snore. The door clanged shut behind Caleb, severing the final tie to his former life. He stood still for a moment, clutching the few items he'd been given: a thin blanket, 2 changes of underwear, a pillow, and some toiletries. I'm Luis, the man finally said, glancing up. Top bunk's yours. Don't touch my stuff. Everyone's got their space here. Understand? Caleb nodded. Got it. He climbed to the top bunk. The mattress was thin, hard, and smelled like chlorine, and something else harder to place. He lay down and stared at the ceiling. Names, dates, crude jokes, and angry scribbles covered the surface. A chaotic chronicle of frustration, despair, and time. I shouldn't be here, he thought. But he was. And he had 7 years to learn how to survive it. The first few days passed like a blur of silent tension and physical trials. Every morning began at 6 a.m. with a blaring siren that made Caleb jolt even before he was fully awake. Inspection. Breakfast in the mess hall. Work assignments. Each day ran like clockwork, yet felt like it stretched on forever. The mess hall had its own unspoken rules, its own map of invisible boundaries. Caleb quickly understood that staying quiet was safest, but showing weakness was dangerous. He watched his inmates split themselves into rigid categories. Blacks sat with blacks, Hispanics with Hispanics, whites with whites. Some tables were clearly claimed by gangs, others marked by status or crime. Don't sit there, Luis warned under his breath as they waited in line for trays. That's the Brotherhood table. They don't like loners. Caleb nodded, grateful. In here, a quiet warning could be the difference between surviving or not. Caleb found a seat in the far corner of the mess hall, where others like him sat, newcomers who hadn't yet earned a place in the complex prison hierarchy. On the third day, during lunch, it happened. A large prisoner approached his table, moving with the quiet menace of someone used to being feared. His nickname was Bull. Caleb didn't know his real name, but he had already heard the stories. one of the most aggressive inmates on the block, volatile, unpredictable. "Hey, pretty boy," Bull called out, looming over the table like a storm cloud. "I hear you're in here for stabbing someone." Caleb kept eating the bland, lukewarm oatmeal in front of him. He knew Bull wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for a reaction, a flicker of fear, something to pounce on. His silence wasn't cowardice. It was calculated. "I'm talking to you," Bull growled and stepped closer. His massive frame blocked out the light, casting a shadow over the table. "You deaf or what?" Caleb felt the muscles in his back tighten. His body, seasoned from years of construction work, instinctively braced for conflict. Calmly, he set the spoon down and looked up at Bull, not defiantly, but without fear. "No," he replied, "just busy." Laughter rippled through nearby tables. Bull's jaw twitched. No one liked to be laughed at, especially someone like him, someone who ruled through intimidation and dominance. Looking foolish could cost him everything. "You think you're smart?" Bull snapped, then swiped the tray off the table. Oatmeal splattered across the floor. "It doesn't work like that in here." This was the moment, the kind that defines a man's fate behind bars. Caleb understood this instinctively. The lines were drawn. Slowly, he rose from the bench. He wasn't big, but he was solid, wiry, built from years of lifting bricks and steel. The key was not to show fear. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said in a low, steady voice. "But I'm not running either." Bull swung without warning, a fast, brutal strike for such a large man. But Caleb was ready. He ducked under the blow and struck back, a sharp jab to the solar plexus. It wasn't rage, just reflex, enough to knock the air out of the bigger man without causing serious injury. Bull doubled over, gasping, his face turning red with a mix of rage and breathlessness. The mess hall hushed. Shock registered on the faces of the surrounding inmates. A newcomer had just taken down Bull and lived. "You little expletive," Bull rasped, regaining his breath, and reached for something in his sleeve. Caleb's senses went on high alert. He braced for another attack, but didn't get the chance to respond. The guards were already rushing in, their boots pounding the floor, batons at the ready. "Cops!" someone shouted, and most of the onlookers scattered, not wanting to be caught in the chaos. "Disperse," one of the guards barked, slamming a baton against the table. "Reed, Perkins, face the wall, hands behind your heads." Caleb obeyed. His body still buzzed with adrenaline. His fingers trembled, but his voice remained steady as they cuffed his wrists and shoved him against the wall. Bull got the same treatment, although it took 3 guards to pin him down. 3 days in the SHU for both of you," an older guard said, annoyed but not surprised. "Be glad it's not worse." They were escorted away in separate directions. As they walked, Caleb heard Bull yelling threats, vowing to find him, to gut him when he least expected it. Strangely, the threats didn't shake him. He had survived worse: the arrest, the trial, the stripping of his freedom. What was one man's fury compared to a system that had already destroyed his life? The SHU turned out to be a strange kind of blessing. A small cell, barren but quiet, with nothing but a concrete bunk and a toilet. No noise, no threats, no eyes watching him, just stillness. For the first time since his arrest, Caleb was truly alone, with his thoughts, with the weight of everything that had led to this. He lay on the hard bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the humming vents and the distant, animal-like cries from other isolation cells. In that sterile silence, memories flooded in. He thought about that night. The girl in the blue dress. The flash of fear in her eyes. The man who had died by his hand. And he finally began to understand. Surviving prison would require more than strength. It would demand something deeper. Something he wasn't sure he had left. The images kept flashing through Caleb's mind, relentlessly vivid and painfully detailed. He saw the bottle shatter again, the jagged edges slicing through flesh, the life draining from the man's eyes in seconds. What terrified him wasn't the violence itself. It was the simplicity of it. How easy it had been to end a life. One instinctive movement, one moment of rage, and everything had changed. Not just for the man who died, but for everyone connected to him. Caleb didn't feel guilt for the act. He knew he had done it to protect a child from a monster. It was necessary. It was right. But he did regret losing control. He wondered again and again if there had been another way. Could he have stopped the man without killing him? Could he have used his strength without giving in to his fury? These questions tormented him, robbing him of sleep. 7 years. He whispered it to himself, lying on the hard prison cot, eyes fixed on the gray ceiling. 7 years for one moment of anger. 7 years for trying to do the right thing. What would those years take from him? And what would be left when they were done? In the holding cell, Caleb cried for the first time since his arrest. Not for himself, but for that terrified little girl who would never forget the night he intervened. For the dead man's family. For the wife who lost her husband. For the children left without a father. And for his own family. His mother, who wept silently in the courtroom. And his sister, who couldn't be there but sent a letter filled with love and sorrow. The tears came quietly, without sound. They brought no answers, only release. But in that release came a sliver of acceptance, a step toward making peace with a brutal new reality. The 3 days he spent in the SHU changed him. When he returned to his regular cell, Luis noticed right away. "You've grown up, man," he said, setting his book aside. "That's how it should be. Prison either breaks you or makes you stronger. I can see which way you're going." Caleb didn't reply, but the words sank deep. He couldn't undo what had happened. He couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to move forward, even in a place like this. Word had spread quickly through the C blocks about what happened in the mess hall. How the new guy stood up to Bull. How he fought back and walked away in one piece. After that, the inmates regarded him differently. With caution, with a measure of respect. No one looked for trouble with Caleb anymore. No one befriended him either, except for a few in his unit who occasionally exchanged small talk. Mostly, Caleb kept to himself. He threw himself into his new job in the prison laundry, a hot, humid, thankless place filled with industrial washing machines and the stench of bleach and sweat. The work was mindless, physically draining, and just difficult enough to keep dark thoughts at bay. But his true refuge was the library. In the dusty stacks of battered books, Caleb found escape. A way to travel without leaving the concrete walls. A way to forget, even briefly, the cold labels that defined him now. Inmate, convict, felon. He devoured everything. Classics, philosophy, history, crime fiction. Each page was a breath of fresh air. Each story a temporary salvation. It was in that quiet sanctuary that he first heard the name Pastor Walker. "If you need someone to talk to, try Walker," said Wilson, the elderly inmate who worked as the librarian. His hands were wrinkled and ink-stained, his eyes soft behind oversized glasses. "He's not one of those preachers who only talks about sin. He's normal." Caleb looked up from the Count of Monte Cristo, a book he was reading for the second time. The story of a wrongfully imprisoned man spoke to something raw in him. "I don't think I need a priest," he replied, turning a page. "I'm not really religious." "Religion's got nothing to do with it," Wilson said with a shrug, stacking books on a shelf. "Walker knows how to listen, and sometimes in here, that's all we need. Someone who sees you as a person, not just a number or a criminal." The word struck Caleb harder than he expected. Since his arrest, he hadn't felt like a person. Just a case. Just a sentence. Just another body in a jumpsuit. "Suit yourself," Wilson added with a knowing smile. "But he's holding a chapel service at 10 tomorrow. Could be a good change of pace." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "And they give out cookies. Not great, but better than the cafeteria's mystery meat." Caleb couldn't help but smile. Not because of the cookies, but because for the first time in weeks, someone was offering him a choice. A simple choice. And maybe, just maybe, a way forward. The idea of breaking free from the daily routine of isolation, labor, and monotony was tempting. More than that, something about Wilson's words had stayed with Caleb. The idea that someone might see him as a person, not just a prisoner. Caleb couldn't explain, even to himself, why he ended up walking to the prison chapel the next morning. Maybe it was boredom, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was that growing sense of loneliness, an ache that had settled deep in his bones and worsened a little more with each passing day. The chapel was tucked away in a separate wing, of the facility. It was a small, simple room, wooden pews lined neatly in rows, a modest altar at the front, and one stained glass window that filtered sunlight into hues of soft yellows and gentle blues. When Caleb entered, the chapel was already half full. The prisoners were scattered across the pews, sitting in loose clusters. Some murmured quietly to each other. A few looked genuinely invested in being there, while others clearly came for the change of scenery, an excuse to escape the routine. Caleb sat in the last row, close to the door, ready to slip out at the first sign of preaching or guilt-tripping. He was already second-guessing his decision, until he noticed a plate of cookies beside him. They were ordinary, store-bought cookies, but still a rare treat compared to the institutional food served daily. Then Pastor Walker entered, and Caleb was caught off guard. He had expected a stern, Bible-thumping preacher, someone who would speak of fire, brimstone, and eternal judgment, someone who would see him only as a sinner. But the man who stood before them was nothing like that. He was middle-aged, with flecks of gray at his temples and sharp, intelligent eyes. His face looked weary but kind, and his presence radiated a quiet, grounded calm. "Good afternoon, my friends," the pastor greeted, his voice deep and soothing. There was no forced cheerfulness, no exaggerated emotion, just warmth. "I'm glad to see you all here today, and I see some new faces." He nodded subtly in Caleb's direction, and a few others, clearly recent arrivals as well. To Caleb's surprise, Pastor Walker didn't launch straight into a sermon. Instead, he began with small talk. He chatted about the weather, a few books he'd been reading, recent headlines from the outside world. It felt more like a conversation than a service. The inmates responded. Some asked questions, others made jokes or added their thoughts. The tension Caleb had carried with him into the chapel began to loosen. Then the pastor shifted gears. "Today," he said, his voice softening, "I'd like to talk about forgiveness." The room quieted. The tone of the room shifted. Everyone leaned in slightly, not wanting to miss a word. "Not forgiveness from others," he continued, "and not even from God, though that's important in its own right. Today is about something harder. Forgiving yourselves." Caleb's shoulders tensed. It was as if the words had been spoken directly to him, had reached into his mind and grabbed hold of the very thoughts he had tried to silence. "Many of us," Walker said, slowly scanning the room, "are here because we did something, maybe out of desperation, maybe out of anger, maybe out of fear. But regardless of why, we're here, and often we punish ourselves far more severely than the courts ever could." His eyes paused on Caleb for just a second. The glance wasn't judgmental, it was understanding, almost empathetic. "We carry guilt like a stone," Walker went on, "and it keeps us from healing, keeps us from moving forward." There was no sermonizing, no theatrics, just sincerity. And Caleb found himself listening, really listening for the first time in days. Pastor Walker stepped forward, closing the distance to the front row. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said, "or to pretend what happened never did. I'm simply asking you to consider this. You cannot be free, not truly, until you make peace with yourself. Even if these walls disappeared tomorrow, without forgiveness, you'd still be trapped." The hour passed quickly. When the pastor finished speaking, he invited anyone who wanted to talk or pray to stay behind. Most inmates quietly filed out. A few lingered to thank him or grab another cookie. But Caleb didn't move. He stayed seated in the last pew, staring at the simple wooden crucifix mounted on the wall. Something about the message had struck a nerve. The idea of self-forgiveness, of being more than the worst thing he'd ever done. It stirred something he had tried hard to bury. He didn't notice Pastor Walker approaching until he was already beside him. When the chapel was nearly empty, Pastor Walker approached with a warm, subtle smile. "You seem new," he said gently. "I don't think I've seen you here before." Caleb looked up. Up close, he could see that the pastor's tired face carried more than fatigue. It held traces of pain. Not obvious, but visible to someone who had endured their own share of it. "Yeah," Caleb replied with quiet restraint. "Just arrived a couple of weeks ago." "Ethan Walker," the pastor said, extending a hand. Caleb read. He shook it firmly, noting with surprise the strength in Walker's grip. Unlike other clergy he'd encountered, whose handshakes were soft and hesitant. This one belonged to a man who knew hard work. "How did you find our little service, Mr. Reed?" Walker asked, his tone curious and kind, completely absent of judgment or pity, something Caleb wasn't used to. "Unusual," Caleb admitted, with complete honesty. "I was expecting something a bit more fire and brimstone. Talk of sin and punishment." Walker let out a laugh, an easy, genuine one. Not like the harsh or mocking laughter Caleb was used to hearing behind bars. This one was different. It was free. "I'm afraid I've let you down then," the pastor grinned. "I only do hellfire on Thursdays." He gave a playful wink. "Tuesdays are reserved for humility and meekness. You got to schedule your sins by the day, otherwise it all gets too confusing." Caleb chuckled, an involuntary reaction. His first real smile since the arrest. The pastor's humor was unexpected, and in a place so devoid of warmth, it felt oddly rebellious. A kind of resistance. "If you ever want to talk," Walker said, his tone growing more sincere, "my door is always open. Literally. It's right next to the chapel, and I'm here most days. You don't have to pray or confess anything. Just stop by talk." "Thank you," Caleb said. And for once, the words weren't empty. He truly meant them. It had been a long time since someone offered him something that felt human. "You're welcome," Walker replied with a smile, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than usual. There was something in the look, not suspicion or judgment, but interest. The kind of attention you offer a person, not a case file. "I hope I'll see you again, Mr. Reed." Caleb gave a small nod and stepped out into the corridor. But the warmth stayed with him. He hadn't planned on returning, but something about Pastor Walker made him want to. For the first time since entering prison, Caleb felt there might be someone behind these gray walls worth knowing. Someone who could help him reclaim a part of his humanity. And that thought gave him something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. Caleb didn't return to the chapel immediately. Something held him back. Not distrust, but uncertainty. He had never sought spiritual guidance before, even on the outside, and certainly not friendship with a priest. But Pastor Walker's words about self-forgiveness lingered. They echoed in the quiet moments before sleep. They followed him during long shifts in the laundry room. A week later, on a Thursday, Caleb made up his mind. He walked to the chapel wing and knocked on the door beside it. True to his word, the door was open. Inside, the space surprised him. Cozy, even homely. Bookshelves lined one wall. A worn but inviting armchair sat in the corner. Photos, probably of family, decorated the desk. "Mr. Reed," Walker greeted with a smile, glancing up from a book. "It's good to see you. Come in, have a seat." "Caleb's fine," he said, easing into the chair across from the desk. "Then call me Ethan," the pastor offered, setting the book aside and opening a drawer. He pulled out a thermos and 2 cups. "Coffee? Not the prison stuff, the real thing. A little perk I managed to hold on to." Caleb accepted with a nod, surprised. The scent of fresh brewed coffee hit him like a wave of memory. One sip, and he was briefly transported back to a cafe or his mother's kitchen. The flavor was so rich it almost hurt. "So," Ethan said, reclining slightly, "what brings you in today?" Caleb hesitated, then answered plainly. "Your words about forgiveness." He paused again, uncertain how to continue. "Do you want to talk about what brought you here?" Walker asked, his voice low and without pressure. "Yes. No. I don't know." Caleb stumbled. Then he exhaled. "I was protecting a girl. A child. From a rapist. It went bad. I killed him." He braced for judgment, for that look of quiet moral disapproval he'd seen 1,000 times. But it didn't come. Instead, Ethan's eyes stayed soft. Compassionate. "You don't feel guilt for what you did," the pastor said, not as a question, but as a statement. Caleb looked up, startled. "No, but I do blame myself for losing control." How could this man understand in seconds what Caleb himself was struggling to put into words? "Yes," he answered quietly. "I didn't mean to kill him, to stop him. Sometimes we're not in control," Pastor Ethan said, his voice soft, his gaze distant. "No matter how hard we try, we do what we believe is right. But the consequences aren't always what we expect." Caleb heard something personal in his tone, as if the pastor wasn't only speaking to him, but about himself. That first conversation marked the beginning of something unexpected. At first, they met once a week. Then it became more frequent. They talked about books, philosophy, life. Ethan turned out to be not only a good listener, but a thoughtful conversationalist, educated but never condescending, wise but never preachy. In the span of 2 months, Caleb shared more with him than he had ever told anyone. He spoke about his childhood in a rough neighborhood, about his mother, strong, tireless, raising him and his sister alone. He talked about dreams that had died long before prison had claimed the rest. Ethan, too, shared parts of his story, carefully but honestly. He spoke of a failed marriage, of his growing disillusionment with the institutional church, and how that path had eventually led him to ministry within prison walls. "Sometimes I think I get more out of our talks than you do," Ethan said one evening, gazing out the window as twilight painted shadows across the chapel. "There are many people here you can really talk to." "People," Caleb teased, smiling. "Not sinners? Not inmates?" Ethan smiled in return, something in it soft and disarming. "Just people." There was a silence, brief but charged. And then their eyes met. Not briefly, not accidentally. The look held, a fraction too long. Caleb felt something shift between them, subtle but undeniable. The next time they met, the tension was already there, quiet but present. They sat a little closer than usual. Their fingers brushed when Ethan handed him a book. Neither of them acknowledged the spark, but neither pulled away. "Try to ease the weight in the air," Caleb asked lightly. "Why prison ministry? Of all places?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes drifting to nowhere in particular. "Because the people here are real," he finally said. "No masks. When you've lost everything, all that's left is what's inside. And here, I can be real too." "Who do they want you to be?" Caleb asked, voice low. Ethan's smile faded. "A righteous man, a family man, a preacher of tradition and certainty." His voice dipped into something bitter. "But those masks, they wear you down. Sooner or later, you have to choose, live the truth or die in a lie. And you chose the truth?" "I try. Every day I try." Their hands were so close on the table now that Caleb could feel the warmth radiating from Ethan's skin. He wasn't sure who moved first, him or the pastor, but suddenly their fingers intertwined. It was a small gesture, innocent from the outside, but to both of them, it meant something more. "This is dangerous," Ethan whispered, though he didn't pull away. "I know," Caleb said softly, squeezing his fingers in return. They didn't go further that day. They simply sat there, hands entwined, talking about books, family, memories, mundane things that suddenly felt sacred. But a line had been crossed, and there was no going back. A week later, Ethan invited Caleb to help sort through a new shipment of donated books for the prison library. The storage room behind the chapel was small and dusty, cluttered with worn cardboard boxes. "Here," Ethan said, handing him a bundle of paperbacks. "These go on the fiction shelf." As Caleb took the stack, their hands touched again, this time lingering. Ethan didn't withdraw. Instead, he let the moment stretch. Caleb looked up, met his gaze. Ethan's eyes were open, vulnerable, unguarded. So much passed between them in silence. "I can't stop thinking about you," Ethan said quietly, his voice trembling just slightly. "It was the first time he used you instead of Mr. Reed. I know it wrong, but—" Caleb didn't let him finish. He placed the books down on the nearest box, stepped forward, and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, tentative, searching. Ethan's lips were soft and warm, tinged with the faint taste of coffee. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Ethan responded, his arms circling Caleb, pulling him closer. In that dusty storeroom, time stilled. The walls vanished. The rules, the risks, the bars, all of it dissolved. There was only touch, breath, quiet, aching connection. "We don't have to," Ethan whispered as they parted, though he still held Caleb close. "I know," Caleb replied, gently brushing a hand against his cheek. And neither of them moved. "But I want it," Ethan whispered, his voice low and raw. "I really do." He closed his eyes, clearly battling with something deep within, then opened them again, this time with a fire in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Me too," he admitted. Then, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed Caleb again. Their second kiss was nothing like the first. It was urgent, hungry, and full of everything they had been holding back. As their lips met with rising intensity, the stack of books tumbled to the floor, forgotten. Ethan pressed Caleb against the shelving unit, and their hands, tentative at first, began to explore with growing confidence and longing. Caleb could feel Ethan's heart pounding under his palm, could feel his breath quick and hot against his neck. But then, footsteps in the hallway. In an instant, the spell broke. Both men pulled back, gasping, their chests heaving from the rush of adrenaline and desire. Caleb crouched to pick up the fallen books, while Ethan straightened his shirt, smoothing his hair with trembling hands. By the time a knock came at the door, they had composed themselves, outwardly at least. "Pastor Walker," a security guard called, peeking inside. "The director wants to see you. Something about a rehab program." "I'll be right there," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the storm still swirling inside him. When the guard disappeared, Ethan turned to Caleb and said in a quiet, urgent tone, "We need to be careful. If anyone finds out—" "Understand," Caleb nodded. "But I don't regret it. Not a second of it." Ethan's lips curled into a soft smile. "Neither do I." He hesitated, then added, "Come to the chapel tomorrow after dinner. Say you want to pray alone. I'll arrange a block bypass. I'll be back in about half an hour." Caleb nodded again, the pulse of excitement already quickening in his chest. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was also the first time in a long while that he felt truly alive. The next evening, they met as planned. The chapel was empty, dimly lit by the soft glow of 2 candles flickering before the altar. Caleb arrived first, his hands trembling slightly as he waited in the hush of that sacred space. But the moment Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him, all hesitation vanished. They didn't speak. There was no need. Their lips found each other in the shadows, and their hands moved quickly, shedding clothes with a quiet urgency. Skin met skin, breath mingled with breath, and in that secluded silence, they gave themselves to each other completely. Ethan was both gentle and intense. His touch washed away Caleb's doubts. Beneath the robes and collar, his body was strong. Unexpectedly so, Caleb traced the scar along his shoulder, the mark of some long-ago accident. He kissed it, feeling Ethan flinch slightly at the sensation. Their connection was a blend of opposites, sacred and sinful, tender and fierce. That night, Caleb discovered a side of Ethan the world had never seen. A man who had suppressed his desires, his truth, for years under the weight of duty and expectation. Afterward, they lay together, wrapped in each other, resting atop Ethan's vestments spread across the chapel floor. Their foreheads touched as they spoke in whispers. "I've never felt like this," Ethan murmured, brushing Caleb's cheek with his fingers. "All my life, I thought something was wrong with me, that I needed to change, that I had to be normal." "You are normal," Caleb replied gently, kissing his fingertips. "Just different. Like me." Ethan exhaled shakily. "My marriage was a mistake. I love Sarah, but not the way I should have. I tried to fit the mold, try to be the man my parents, the church, society all expected me to be. I thought eventually it would work itself out. I just needed time. But in the end, I realized I wasn't just lying to myself. I was lying to her too. And that wasn't fair." He paused. "We divorced 5 years ago. She found someone else, someone who could love her the way she deserved. And I came here. I thought I could serve, hide from the judgmental eyes, maybe even find peace. And instead, you found me," Caleb said with a soft smile, snuggling against him. Ethan smiled faintly. "Found you," he echoed. "And now I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse." After that night, they began meeting regularly. In the chapel after lights out, in the storeroom, sometimes even in Ethan's office, with the door locked, blinds drawn. They were cautious, always arriving at different times, never displaying affection in public. If anyone walked by, they'd talk about scripture, books, or theology, just 2 men engaged in harmless spiritual discussion. But in private, the walls came down. Passion took over. Caleb had never imagined he could feel this way about another man. But with Ethan, it all made sense. It felt natural, right? Meant to be. And Ethan slowly allowed himself to be vulnerable, not just physically but emotionally. He shared more of his past, his religious upbringing, his long-standing battle with desire, his attempts to cure it through prayer, devotion, even marriage. I thought I hated myself, he confessed one night, lying in Caleb's arms. But I didn't. I was just afraid. Afraid to be myself. Afraid of being judged. Afraid God would turn his back on me. What do you think now? Caleb asked softly, pressing a kiss to Ethan's temple. That love can't be a sin, Ethan replied in a whisper. That God is bigger than the books say, and that for the first time in my life, I feel whole. Their secret meetings became Caleb's only true escape from the crushing rhythm of prison life. In those stolen moments with Ethan, he wasn't inmate number 408. He was just Caleb, a man with feelings, hopes, and desires. With Ethan, he felt human again. They started to talk about the future, still vague, still uncertain, but laced with hope. Dreams took shape in quiet murmurs under dim candlelight. Ethan imagined a small house by a lake, a simple place far from judgment and fear. He spoke of evenings by the fireplace and watching sunrises together. I could get a job at an independent church, he mused. Or maybe leave the church altogether, go into counseling, or teach somewhere peaceful. And I could study design, Caleb added. I've always wanted to work with interiors, make spaces that feel warm and alive. They both knew these were just fantasies, maybe unreachable, but the very act of imagining them made it easier to endure the present. One day, Caleb gave Ethan a bracelet he had made himself. Crafted from threads he'd begged from the workshop, it was simple, but carefully woven with two intertwined lines, a pattern he created to symbolize their bond. Ethan wore it hidden under his shirt sleeve, where no one could see. In return, he gave Caleb a small, worn leather-bound prayer book. Not for the prayers, he smiled, but so you'll always have something of mine with you. But nothing so fragile could last forever. Gradually, Caleb began to sense eyes on them, especially those of a particular guard, a short, rigid man named Ward with cold, calculating eyes and a posture too stiff to be natural. He's watching us, Caleb whispered one night as they lay together on the chapel floor, wrapped in the only blanket they had. Ward, I've seen the way he looks at us. I know, Ethan sighed. He checks the chapel when I'm not here. He's been asking inmates about our conversations. Do you think he suspects? Maybe, but there's something else, something deeper. It's personal for him, not just suspicion. Hatred. They began meeting less frequently, taking more precautions. But that only heightened their connection. The longer they were apart, the more intense each meeting became. Every touch, every stolen glance felt like a miracle. 2 weeks later, they nearly got caught. They were in the storeroom behind the chapel, lost in each other's arms, when the door suddenly creaked open. Caleb barely managed to grab his shirt and stumble a few steps away. Ethan turned his back to the entrance, pretending to search the top shelf. I'm sorry, Pastor, a voice said from the doorway, cold, sharp. It was Ward. Didn't realize you were in here with company. Mr. Reed is helping me sort inventory, Ethan replied, keeping his tone steady, eyes fixed on the shelf. Anything urgent? No, sir. Ward lingered in the doorway, letting his gaze wander around the room. His eyes paused on the fallen books, on Caleb's half-buttoned shirt. There was something in his stare, dark, simmering, almost pained. Just checking rooms, he muttered. When the door finally closed, silence hung between them like a threat. Did you see the look in his eyes? Caleb whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to kill us. There's something more, Caleb said. It wasn't just judgment. It felt personal. I've heard of people like him. Ethan murmured as he quickly refastened his shirt. People who lash out at others for what they can't accept in themselves. Caleb nodded in grim agreement. He'd met men like that before. Men whose cruelty stemmed from the reflection they saw in someone else. Not long after, Ward stopped Caleb in the corridor, just outside the chapel. Spending a lot of time with the Pastor Reed, he said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Getting real spiritual, huh? He's helping me work through some things, Caleb answered quietly, trying to keep his voice even. I'm sure he is. Ward's eyes narrowed, and Caleb saw the barely concealed fury behind them. People like you twist everything, even religion. I don't know what you mean, Caleb replied, meeting his gaze directly. Ward stepped closer. His voice dropped, barely above a whisper, but sharp as a blade. My father taught me what to do with men like you, he said. Taught me very clearly. Caleb felt a chill ripple through him. In Ward's eyes, he saw a storm of hatred, disgust, and something else. Something that looked like pain. And for just a moment, he understood. Those eyes, they weren't just hostile, they were a mirror. A twisted, fractured reflection of Caleb's own emotions, seen through the distorted lens of hatred. Careful, Reed, Ward muttered as he backed away. It's easy for accidents to happen within these walls. That warning echoed in Caleb's mind long after Ward had disappeared. Later, he told Ethan about the encounter. The pastor paled visibly, rubbing his neck as a deep worry took hold of him. This isn't just personal animosity, he said, voice low and tight. This is bigotry, dangerous bigotry. I'm afraid he might do something irreversible. Caleb felt anxiety grip his chest. What are we going to do? He asked. The question was barely a whisper, but it carried all the weight of fear. Ethan paused, thinking. Maybe I should talk to the warden, he said slowly. Not about us, of course, but about Ward's behavior. His threats. It's unacceptable for a prison officer. No, Caleb shook his head firmly. That would only make it worse. People like him, when they feel threatened, they become more dangerous. Then what? Ethan's voice cracked. Do we just sit and wait for him to act? We need to be careful, Caleb said, taking Ethan's hands in his own. Maybe we should stop seeing each other for a while. Let things calm down. Ethan nodded reluctantly, but the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. I'll try to talk to him, he said after a long silence. Not directly about what he suspects, but as a pastor. Maybe I can reach him. Caleb squeezed his hands tighter. It's risky. I've seen men like him. You can't change someone's mind with words when they're drowning in their own hate. I have to try, Ethan said softly. That's my calling, isn't it? To reach even the most misguided souls. And I can't give this up. Not yet. These moments, our time together, they've become too important to me. Their final meeting came 3 days later. Ethan arrived at the chapel late in the afternoon, just when Caleb had begun to fear he wouldn't come at all. The pastor looked exhausted. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of something unspoken. What happened? Caleb asked, wrapping his arms around him. I talked to Ward, Ethan replied quietly, holding Caleb close. I asked him to come to my office, said it was about the rehabilitation program. How did it go? Ethan shook his head. Terribly. I've never seen so much hate in someone's eyes. I tried to talk to him about compassion, about how we all wrestle with demons, but he started yelling, screaming things about his father, how he taught him to be a real man. Did he threaten you? Not directly, Ethan sighed, but the anger in his voice, it was more than suspicion. He knows, Caleb. I'm sure of it. And it's driving him mad, because it's hitting something personal. I'm scared for you, Caleb whispered, pressing his forehead against Ethan's. People like him, unpredictable, unstable, are the most dangerous. I'm more afraid for you, Ethan said. You're a prisoner. You have no protection. I think I should request a transfer. If I go, maybe he'll back off. No, Caleb pulled back, gripping his shoulders. I can't lose you. We'll find another way. I don't know if there's one, Ethan said, a shadow of sorrow in his voice. But I can't walk away. Not now. Not when I've finally learned what it means to truly be alive. They talked late into the evening, sifting through possibilities, trying to find a safe way forward. In the end, Ethan decided he would speak with the prison director, not about their relationship, but about Ward's disturbing behavior and emotional instability. I love you, he said as they embraced goodbye. No matter what happens, remember that. And I love you, Caleb replied, kissing him gently. We'll get through this. together. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that it would be their last kiss. 2 days later, the prison was shaken by terrible news. Caleb woke to a noise that didn't belong. After 2 months, he'd grown used to the routine. The clank of metal doors at 6 a.m., the murmur of voices in the mess hall, the mechanical hum of gates sliding open. But this sound was different. It rose like a wave, frantic, panicked. Something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked Louise, who was already standing at the cell door, trying to listen. "Something happened in cell block D last night," his cellmate said. "They're saying there was a riot. Someone's dead." Caleb's heart lurched. His thoughts immediately turned to Ethan. He often stayed late in the chapel, preparing sermons or simply enjoying the stillness. No, Caleb thought. Not him. Please, not him. Who? He asked, his voice tight, trying to sound calm. Who died? I don't know exactly, Louise shrugged. But there's a lot of guards. Police, too. The schedule's already off. Caleb stood frozen. Cold dread settled in his chest. Something terrible had happened. And in his heart, he already knew. They weren't allowed to go to the mess hall for breakfast that morning. Instead, trays were brought directly to the cells. The atmosphere was tense. Guards moved stiffly, their eyes avoiding contact. They answered questions with clipped, one-word responses. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. It wasn't until lunchtime, as the prisoners were being led into the yard, that the rumor finally broke. It's the pastor, someone muttered from the next cell over. Caleb turned, confused. Walker, the prisoner added. They found him dead. Murdered. In the restroom outside the chapel. What? Caleb stopped walking. They drowned him, the man continued. Face down in the toilet. Someone held him there till he stopped breathing. Caleb froze. The blood drained from his face, his ears rang, and for a moment, the world spun. He clutched at the mesh fence for support, his knees threatening to give way. Hey, you okay? Someone called out, their voice distant and muffled, like it was being spoken through thick cotton. Caleb shook his head, but couldn't find the words. Something inside him cracked, something vital. All that remained was a hollow ache, the echo of a pain too deep to name. Later, when he was able to speak again, he asked the same prisoner, "Is it true? About the pastor?" The man nodded gravely. Yeah, Ward was the one who found him. They think someone from D Block snuck out during the riot and did it. Revenge, maybe, or something personal. Ward. The name struck Caleb like a hammer to the chest. He remembered their last conversation. Ethan had looked so troubled, so tired, but resolute in his decision to report Ward's disturbing behavior. I love you. Whatever happens, remember that. Ethan's last words had sounded like a farewell. Now, Caleb understood why. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He moved like a ghost, answering when spoken to, doing what he was told. But inside, he was gone, devastated, shattered, and swallowed by a grief he wasn't allowed to show. No one knew that Pastor Walker had been more than a spiritual advisor to him. No one knew that behind the stolen glances and careful conversations had existed a love so fierce it had breathed life back into him. That evening, locked in his cell, Caleb finally allowed himself to break. He curled up on the top bunk, turned his face to the wall, and sobbed quietly into the thin pillow. His body trembled with silent grief. Louise, his cellmate, said nothing. He likely heard, but pretended not to notice. The following morning, a group of police officers arrived. Not just any officers, detectives from the homicide division. They began questioning the inmates, starting with those known to have been close to Pastor Walker. After lunch, Caleb heard the guard's voice at the cell door. Reed, let's go. Detective wants to see you. He had expected this. Steeling himself, Caleb nodded and followed. In the interview room, a woman sat waiting. She looked to be in her early 40s, short brown hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm Detective Sarah Nolan, she said, offering a professional nod. Please have a seat, Mr. Reed. Caleb sat across from her, doing his best to mask the grief bubbling just beneath the surface. I understand you had regular contact with Pastor Walker, she said, jumping right in. Yes, Caleb answered, his voice steady. He helped me adjust when I got here. We talked about philosophy, books. He was a good man. When was the last time you saw him? Caleb paused. The truth was too raw, too dangerous. Their final kiss. The warmth of Ethan's body. His whispered "I love you." None of that could be said. 3 days ago, Caleb replied instead. At chapel service. We spoke briefly afterward. And what did you talk about? He gave me this. Caleb gestured to the small leather prayer book in his hands. Said it might interest me. Detective Nolan looked at it, but didn't reach for it. Her gaze returned to his face. Mr. Reed, are you aware that Pastor Walker's death was particularly brutal? I've heard rumors, Caleb said, swallowing hard as nausea crept up his throat. They drowned him, she said calmly, watching his reaction. Held his head in the toilet until he suffocated. This wasn't just a killing, it was an execution. Deliberate. Humiliating. Caleb clenched his fist beneath the table to stop his hands from trembling. Why are you telling me this? He asked, voice tight. Because this wasn't random. It didn't happen in the chaos of a riot. This was personal. And I need to know, did Pastor Walker have any enemies? Anyone who might have had a reason to do this? Caleb met her gaze. He couldn't lie, but he couldn't tell the whole truth either. Everyone I knew respected him, he said carefully. He wasn't like other prison chaplains. He was different. What do you mean? Detective Nolan asked. He saw us as people, Caleb said quietly, the words slipping from his mouth with raw honesty. Not just prisoners. He spoke from the heart now, letting the grief bleed through his voice. He didn't judge, didn't preach or lecture. He just listened. He helped. That's rare in this place. Detective Nolan studied him, as if she were trying to see past the surface, trying to glimpse whatever lay beneath the mask Caleb wore each day. After a pause, she continued. Some of the inmates say you were especially close to Pastor Walker. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. We got along well, he answered carefully. We had common interests, literature, philosophy, that's it. What else is there supposed to be? He added, meeting her gaze, trying to feign confusion. Nolan didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she asked, where were you the night of the murder? In my cell, Caleb replied. Same as everyone else in SE Block. There wasn't a disturbance on our side. Can anyone confirm that? My cellmate, Luis Delgado, and the guards on duty who did rounds that night. She wrote something in her notebook and gave a small nod. Had you noticed anything unusual about the pastor lately? Was he troubled? Anxious? Caleb hesitated. The question struck too close. Ethan had been troubled, deeply, because of Ward. But to share that now meant coming dangerously close to revealing the nature of their relationship. And worse, it meant putting Ward on the radar without solid proof. He'd seemed preoccupied, Caleb said finally, like something was weighing on him. But he wouldn't say what. Do you have any idea what it might have been? No, Caleb lied, swallowing hard. I really don't. Detective Nolan stared at him for a few seconds, her expression unreadable, then slowly closed her notebook. Thank you for your time, Mr. Reed. If you remember anything else that might be helpful, don't hesitate to reach out. Back in his cell, Caleb felt like his insides had been wrung dry. He was shivering, not from cold, but from emotional exhaustion. The conversation with the detective had drained him. He felt guilt for hiding the truth. Guilt for not protecting Ethan better. Guilt for not pointing to the man he suspected was behind the murder. But without proof, what could he say? Worse, if Ward found out he suspected him. What would happen then? Another accident? Another toilet bowl? In the days that followed, Caleb began to conduct his own quiet investigation. Discreetly, cautiously, he started watching Ward, observing his behavior, his conversations with other guards, his interactions with inmates. Something had changed. Ward had always been cold, but now he was twitchy, jumpy. He snapped at inmates over nothing, hovered near the chapel more often than usual, pacing like a man haunted by something he couldn't shake. Caleb was certain of it. Ward was watching him too. Every move, every glance, every whispered word. He began asking around. Through careful conversations with other inmates, especially those working in the admin wing, Caleb pieced together a profile. Ward had been working at Riverside for about 5 years. Before that, he was in the military, though no one knew why he left. He was withdrawn, antisocial, and rarely spoke about his past. He lives alone, one inmate said. Never talks about family. Only once, another added. I overheard him on the phone, saying something like, "My father was right to beat him with a belt. He grew up to be a man." Caleb's stomach twisted. It lined up perfectly with what Ethan had told him after their final conversation, about how Ward had raged about his father, about how he had been raised to suppress, to hate. Meanwhile, Detective Nolan continued her own investigation. Caleb noticed her moving around the prison, interviewing staff, reviewing security footage. Once, he even saw her speaking to Ward in a hallway, quietly, but with unmistakable tension in their body language. The breakthrough came a week after Ethan's murder. Caleb was working in a laundry room, sorting clothes, when he overheard two housekeeping inmates talking. They replaced that toilet chemical thing, one said casually. The one that colors the water. Only in the admin building, though. First floor. Still old everywhere else. Yeah, but that stuff's strong. It stains like hell. Johnson ruined his sleeve cleaning it. Had to toss the whole shirt. Caleb froze. The restroom near the chapel, the one where Ethan had been found, was in the administration building. First floor. If the cleaning agent was that potent, then any fabric that came in contact with it would show traces. He glanced at the pile of clothes that had just been brought in for washing. Among them were the guards' uniforms, gray, long-sleeve shirts. Quietly, he scanned through them, and then he found it. Faint blue stains along the cuffs and near the hem. Barely noticeable, but definitely not regular dirt. Caleb stared at the shirt, his heart pounding. It wasn't proof. Not yet, but it was a start, and it might just be enough to uncover the truth. He checked the tag on the collar. Ward v. Travis Ward. It wasn't the kind of evidence that would hold up in court, at least not on its own, but it was something real, something that could steer the investigation in the right direction. If Ward had drowned Ethan, if he'd held his head down in that toilet, his sleeves would have touched the chemically treated water. And only one restroom in the entire prison used that particular cleaner, the one that dyed the water blue. That bathroom was in the administration building, near the chapel. First floor. Now Caleb just had to find a way to get this information to Detective Nolan, without exposing himself. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tommy, one of the inmates who worked as an assistant in the admin office where interrogations were held, was someone Caleb could trust, at least a little. "I need a favor," Caleb said to him the next day. "A note. For Detective Nolan. Can you pass it along anonymously?" Tommy squinted, suspicious. "Snitching? I didn't think you were that kind of guy." "It's about the pastor," Caleb said quietly. "He was a good man. He deserves justice." Tommy held his gaze for a long moment. Then finally, he gave a small nod. "Give me the note," he said. "I won't say who it came from." Caleb scribbled a short message on a scrap of paper. "Check Ward's uniform for blue stains from toilet cleaner. The restroom where the pastor was killed uses a new chemical dye. Only in the admin building, first floor. Nowhere else." That same day, Detective Nolan returned to the prison. She ordered a chemical analysis of all recently laundered uniforms and pulled facility supply logs for cleaning products. She was nothing if not thorough. 2 days later, word spread like fire. Ward had been arrested, handcuffed, taken away. They had found traces of the same blue chemical from that restroom on the cuffs of his uniform. Surveillance footage confirmed that he had entered the administration wing the night of the murder, despite being assigned to a different cell block. Caleb didn't feel joy, not even relief, only a quiet, bitter emptiness. Ethan was still gone. No justice could bring him back. That evening, Caleb was summoned to see Detective Nolan. "We've arrested Officer Ward," she said without small talk. "We found evidence linking him to Pastor Walker's murder. Traces of chemicals on his uniform. Inconsistencies in his story." Caleb nodded, silent. There was nothing to say, but she continued, watching him carefully. "I think you already knew it was him." Caleb's breath caught, but he said nothing. "And I think," she leaned forward slightly, voice gentler now, "you know why he did it." "I don't know what you mean," Caleb replied, guarded. Nolan's tone softened further. "Mr. Reed, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm not here to judge you. I just want to understand." She paused, then asked gently, "There was a special relationship between you and Pastor Walker, wasn't there? More than friendship." Caleb closed his eyes. The weight he had been carrying for so long, the silence, the secrecy, finally cracked. He nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "We loved each other." Detective Nolan gave a slow nod, as if she had just received the confirmation she'd been waiting for. And Ward knew, or at least suspected. "Ethan thought he did," Caleb said. "He said Ward was aggressive during their last conversation. Yelled about how his father taught him to hate people like us. Like me. Like us," he corrected with quiet defiance. Ethan believed Ward was struggling with it himself. That the hatred, it was self-hatred. Nolan nodded thoughtfully. "Ward confessed," she said after a long pause. "Once we showed him the uniform test results and surveillance footage. But the strangest part," she leaned back, eyes dark with unease. "He didn't show an ounce of remorse." Caleb felt something sour rising in his throat. "He said he did what he had to do," Nolan continued. "Said his father would be proud." Then she hesitated. He described the murder in detail. How he waited outside the chapel. How he stalked the pastor, dragged him into the restroom. How he held his head down in the toilet. Until he stopped fighting. He said men like him deserved to die that way. Caleb turned away, the nausea now unavoidable. There was no comfort in justice. Not in this place. Not when a man you loved died alone, in the dark, drowning in hatred that wasn't even his own. Caleb clenched his fists, struggling to contain the wave of rage and sorrow surging through him. "It wasn't impulsive," Detective Nolan said quietly. "He planned it, waited for the right moment. The prison riot gave him the perfect cover." "I should have protected him," Caleb whispered, his voice tight as tears stung his eyes. "I should have seen it coming. I should have known Ward was capable of this." "You couldn't have known," Nolan replied gently. "And because of you, we caught him. Because of you, he'll face justice." Caleb nodded slowly, but there was no comfort in her words. Justice didn't bring Ethan back. A man who lived with compassion and quiet strength had died in a filthy prison bathroom at the hands of someone consumed by hate. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. "To me, to our story?" "Officially," Nolan said, "Pastor Walker was murdered by a guard who acted out of personal animosity. The rest, your relationship, won't be mentioned in the reports. It isn't relevant to the investigation." "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. "Don't thank me," she replied, shaking her head. "I'm just doing my job. And part of that job is preserving the dignity of those we lose." When the detective left, Caleb was escorted back to his cell. The truth had been exposed. Ward was gone. Justice had been served. But none of it made the loss easier. That evening, once the buzz of rumors had died down and the cell block grew quiet, Caleb asked for permission to visit the chapel. The new guard, Ward's replacement, seemed surprised but granted him 15 minutes. The chapel was empty and still. The sun was low in the sky, casting golden light through the stained glass window. Reds and ambers danced across the floor and pews. Caleb sat in the last row, the same place he had first spoken to Ethan. He reached in his shirt and pulled out the small, worn prayer book Ethan had once given him. The leather cover was cracked and soft from use. Its yellowed pages held old creases and fading bookmarks, places Ethan had returned to again and again. Caleb traced the edges with his fingers, lingering on the corners that had once felt Ethan's hands. For others, it was just a book. For Caleb, it was a treasure. In the silence of the chapel, he didn't feel peace exactly, but he did feel clarity. The pain remained, sharp and ever-present, but the devastation had dulled into something more bearable. Ward had been caught. The truth had come to light. But none of it could change one unalterable fact. Ethan was gone. And yet, sitting there in the quiet, Caleb felt closer to him than ever. Maybe, somehow, a piece of Ethan's spirit still lingered within these walls. Walls that had absorbed his kindness, his prayers, his unwavering belief in love. To love is to be vulnerable, Ethan had once said. Only now did Caleb truly understand. Vulnerable to pain, to grief, to memory. Sunlight flickered across the pews in stained glass hues. Soon the day would end. Another would begin. Tom did not stop, not even for morning. When a guard returned, Caleb was already standing. He slipped the prayer book gently into the inside pocket of his shirt. "Ready?" the guard asked. "Yes," Caleb said. As he stepped out of the chapel, he didn't look back. There was no need. What mattered, he carried with him.